Hello, I'm Kimberly Theidon, and I'm the Henry J. Laird Professor in International Humanitarian Studies here at Fletcher, and it's my pleasure today to be talking with Andrea Goldstein, Navy veteran and proud MALD candidate, and I'm delighted to be here. And what I'd like to ask you first is, what prompted you to start the research?
Well, Professor Theidon, thank you for having me today. So I served on active duty for 7 years, and the research really came out of two things. I was a historian as an undergraduate, and have always been an amateur historian, and had studied women in war, including combatants. Women who disguised themselves as men to fight in the Civil War was the topic I studied for my undergraduate thesis. Then the other side of the coin was the fact that I was having all of these conversations with my friends that I'd served with, and started to recognize these patterns of stories that weren't being told, and feeling very frustrated that there was this narrative about women serving in the current era and in eras before that wasn't really part of the popular narrative. So I wanted to really capture that and find a way to share it with the public.
Well, and you're doing it very effectively. And one of the things that strikes me is you've told me that many of the women, they don't identify as veterans. And I'm curious if you can say more about why you think that is.
So by identify, I don't just mean think of themselves as veterans. Women from previous eras often didn't consider themselves veterans. A lot of women from, I would say, the Cold War era, the 1980s on, do, but don't necessarily actively identify as veterans in their communities. So they may not be joining veteran-facing organizations from your legacy organizations like the American Legion and Veterans of Foreign Wars, to even like the Fletcher Veterans Club or New England Veterans. And I didn't expect this, but through my interviews, I was able to map out a number of experiences that caused women to not really want to participate in the veteran community after they leave the service. And a lot of it is just frustration and exhaustion with having to try to fit in what you're promised is a brotherhood and doesn't necessarily want you.
This is very powerful, because not only does it not allow them to receive the kind of almost admiration that goes with being a veteran these days, but also I imagine this is tied to benefits. I mean, what sort of benefits women do and do not receive if they don't come forward self-identifying as veterans?
Exactly, that's a huge part of it. And I mean, I can speak for myself. I use VA healthcare. I'm going to school here on the GI Bill. I'll have the opportunity to get a VA loan when, wherever I decide to live after graduating. And I've received so much social support because I've actively identified as a veteran. At my summer internship, I worked in a Fortune 50 company, and I was essentially tapped on the shoulder to meet with some very high-ranking people in this organization, partially because I was a veteran. And if you don't put yourself out there as a veteran, you may not necessarily hear about some of these resources. And so that's just from a professional development standpoint. On the other side of the coin, from a health standpoint, women veterans are 250% more likely to commit suicide than women who have never served in the military. And that number is largely women who do not participate in VA healthcare because they may have heard rumors about it, they may have heard that it doesn't meet their needs. And while there are differences between different VA healthcare systems, if you don't go, you don't know about it.
That is a staggering statistic. And I'm curious, you mentioned the Brotherhood. So I'm curious where the sisters fit into the Brotherhood. And also, is there something that happened during their time in whatever branch of the armed forces that also influences the suicide rate and perhaps sense of isolation?
Absolutely. So, like I said, we're promised a brotherhood when we enlist or go into commissioning programs, only to find that at best you feel a little bit awkwardly out of place and can't necessarily place it. And at worst, experience hostility, sexual violence, harassment. And some of that begins at the very beginning at boot camp or officer candidate school, where I can think of my own experience where oftentimes the male candidates at officer candidate school were called candidates and the female candidates were called female. And several of the women that I interviewed repeated the same story where it was the men were called recruit and the women were called female. And so from the very beginning, you were somehow told that you were different and that you were not part of the standard service member. And that continues. Then the next milestone I found was what I would call a mid-career betrayal. For many women, the reported statistic is 25% of service women encounter sexual violence while they're serving.
And that's reported.
And that is reported.
Right.
If you were to include sexual harassment, my personal opinion is that it would be 100%. Because you either experience it or you are aware of the fact that that threat is constantly there. And so whether that was what these women experienced or there were 2 women who I spoke to who were fired for in one case for reasons that were very, very much related to gender discrimination. There's some kind of betrayal that happens there. And oftentimes, and then in between, there are these little, prods that say, oh, well, your uniform doesn't fit properly because it's a unisex uniform, but it's actually designed for men. Or being asked if you go to a medical appointment in civilian clothes for your sponsor's social security number as opposed to your own. And this constant having to explain yourself often causes women not to self-identify. And a lot of these experiences, sexual violence, or also sometimes other health issues that manifest themselves differently in women, can have really devastating effects when women leave the service.
And I think you're getting at this idea of the institutional betrayal. So you join, and with all of the good faith and the commitment and the training, and then you find out the institution betrays you when you need it. And I think this is a recurring theme with large institutions in general.
Yes.
Me Too, Time's Up, the Invisible War. I mean, I think this is part of a phenomenon. I'm so glad it's being addressed. What was the most surprising finding in your research? Something that even you as a veteran didn't anticipate?
So I think I conducted maybe my 4th or 5th formal interview. So I've interfaced officially as part of this project with hundreds of women veterans on social media, at conferences, but I conducted over 24 formal interviews where I had a question guide, and by the 4th or 5th one, I was really overwhelmed with how we all had these very, very similar experiences across generations. And we all felt so alone. And that was very remarkable to me. And the other part of it is a lot of us really enjoyed serving. I loved the Navy. I loved serving in the Navy. But we felt this disconnect in, I feel very alone. I feel something is not quite right, and I know what this could be, and trying to marry those up is very emotionally taxing.
This is, I can imagine just having this be on and on across your entire service career. And then again, this sort of, I keep coming back to stories left untold. It's very powerful because that is part of what you're helping women. You're creating a space for them to talk about these things. And I think many of us have women veterans in our lives that we would like to be more supportive of. And I'd be curious if you have some suggestions to people who are listening. What can we do to be more supportive? How can we change this?
I think one of the most important things to do is to genuinely ask insightful questions. What was meaningful to you? What was meaningful to you about your service? What were some of the most powerful experiences you had? These open-ended questions that give people the opportunity to talk about what they're most comfortable discussing. I've received questions like, did you go in harm's way? What's someone like you doing in the military? And or I hear the rate of sexual violence is really high in the military. What can you tell me about that? And the women I interviewed reiterated having that same experience. Those don't give you the opportunity to, I want to tell you about the time I saw a meteor shower in the middle of the Gulf of Aden, or the friends that I made. And if we do that, we can also start to tell about experiences that our friends and family who didn't serve can actually relate to, and help bridge the civil-military divide.
And one last thing I do want to ask you, because I realize we're down to the last minute here. What I've been so impressed by is how much you've been publishing. And I frequently sit with students who are trying to decide, oh, I don't want to do a capstone thesis. Why would I write things? I want to be a practitioner. I want to go into consulting. And I've tried to suggest you as a great example, someone who has been publishing extensively, conducting research about your experiences, about other women's experiences, and now you're not applying for consulting jobs, they're looking for you because you've established yourself as an expert. I think this is such an important piece of this, and if you could say a few more words about it to the students who are still wondering, how do you make it in consulting?
You can write your way into a job.
Right.
I've been writing and publishing consistently for 4 years, 2 years under a pseudonym when I was still on active duty, and then since I've left active duty. And that is how you establish that you are a subject matter expert and establish your brand, and people will come to you. I've started consulting because people found me through articles that I'd written and found me on Twitter, and it is like I said, you can write your way into a job.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. And what I want to leave people with is how important your work is. I mean, when you tell me a statistic, 250% increased rates of suicide, then I think we should all be paying much more attention to this. Thank you so much.
Thank you.